Well, I hope you have all had a good Christmas. I hope you've had a good New Year. And today is a really exciting moment for me because I get the privilege of starting a new series that we're going to be working our way through, and that's in the book of Ruth. Now, if you've got a Bible, it's one of those books that can very easily kind of get lost in the pages of the Old Testament. It's near the front of the Old Testament, and it's straight after the book of Judges. And we're going to be spending 4 weeks in the book of Ruth. Now, you might be sat at home wondering to yourself, why are we starting 2021 whilst in the midst of a pandemic in such a small, inconsequential book in the Old Testament? I've got 3 reasons why I think this is such an incredible book for us to be looking at. In fact, I think this is probably one of the most important books that you and I could be reading as we navigate through this current pandemic that we're going through. The first is this. If you're here with us this morning online, exploring Christianity, I think this book is a wonderful book to read because it shows Christianity in ordinary life. The opening pages speak about a guy called Elimelech, his wife Naomi, their 2 sons, wives. None of these people were successful. None of these people were kind of leading leaders in their nation. They were ordinary Joes and ordinary Janes, and yet this whole book speaks about ordinary life and how God inhabits the ordinary. No one in this whole book was famous, yet it speaks about the wonderful activity of God in and amongst the ordinary. And if you're anything like me, my life so often feels very ordinary. And I want to see God's activity, God at work in and amongst the ordinary. The second reason why I believe it's so important that we spend time pausing in this book is for those of you who would maybe describe yourself as a Christian, but the single or the primary lens that you look at your Christian life through is the lens of the dramatic, the lens of the powerful. Every evaluation that you make about Christian things is how much dramatic things have taken place within a set period of time. Friends, this book has nothing dramatic that takes place. This book is filled with utterly ordinary, you might even call it mundane life. There's no miracles, so to speak. And yet every page, every paragraph, every sentence and every word of this story is filled up with the activity of God if you have eyes to see it. And so I really want to encourage you, if your primary lens that you see the world through is a lens of the dramatic, the lens of the supernatural, I want to encourage you to allow Ruth and Naomi and this story to lead you into a deeper understanding of your God, who is a God who is more than able to work in and amongst the ordinary. A God who can work in the mundane Mondays and the dull Tuesdays and even the depressing Wednesdays. I want you to start to see that God who's at work. And finally, this story is for people who look around at the desperate suffering and pain that they see in the world, particularly in a season when there is a pandemic that is ravaging the world, and they wonder in the secret parts of their hearts, where are you, God? This story is for people who have that question burdening them. This is for people who look around at their world and once they had dreams, once they had hopes, but those dreams and those hopes are now in tatters, and they're looking at their dreams and they're looking at their hopes, and all they see is a pile of ash, and then they look up and they wonder, God, where were you when these things were more than just a pile of ash? This story brings pain and suffering, and devotion and worship, and it brings them into the same room and it asks the question, can these things be bedfellows or not? And I want to give you a warning. Actually, I want to give you two warnings. The first warning is this: don't be too quick to tidy this story up. One of the dangers that Christians have is that we have a whole bunch of cliche sayings that we use to tidy up mystery, to tidy up situations that aren't that tidy, to tidy up situations that God is more able to work in than our brains can comprehend. And so we have these cliche sayings. And this book is going to put some holes through some of those cliche sayings. But hopefully it's also going to lead you to greater devotion, greater worship to the God who is always present, even in and amongst the ordinary. My second warning is this: maybe you're going to be surprised with how this book deals with all of those issues that I've just laid out. Maybe you're going to be surprised that it doesn't give you the answers that you were looking for, but I want to encourage you, don't dismiss what Ruth has to say. Engage with this story. I mean, it's a wonderful love story, but it's way more than that. It's a story that is telling us about the nature of God in and amongst the ordinary life that you and I live. So shall we read chapter 1 together? Ruth, chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of their 2 sons was Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with 2 sons. Friends, I just want to pause here a moment. Don't read this as some disinterested report about something that was taking place 3,000 years ago. Try and immerse yourself in the story. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, the other Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old and to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Then Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her. She stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. The first chapter of the book of Ruth is underpinned by one massive idea. And the massive idea that underpins the first chapter of the book of Ruth is this: that God is providentially in control of all things. Now, if you don't know what the word providence means, don't worry, we'll get to that in a few moments. But listen to how Naomi speaks about her life to those around her. Ruth 1 verse 13, "Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has caused me to suffer." Ruth 1:21, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why should you call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy?" And friends, at this moment, I want to bring you back to my warning. Don't be too quick to tidy up passages. Don't be too quick to roll out the cliches. Because the danger with cliches is they're a way of us keeping us from the troubling passages of Scripture. Cliches keep us from that. It's like we've simplified things down. We've made God in our own image, and we've simplified him down so we don't have to engage with actually what the text says. I want to encourage you to not go there, but to allow these passages to get on the inside of your hearts and to start to hear what Naomi is actually saying. You see, Naomi believed that God was working behind the scenes in all things, not just the things that she could understand. Naomi believed that God was the God who was concerned and active and engaged in all areas of her life, even the bits of her life that right at that moment felt bitter. You see, there's such a danger that we can start to fall into the language of fatalism, or the language of chance, or the language that life just happens because it happens. Naomi didn't have that view on life. Naomi saw that her God, the one true living God, was actively, relationally engaged not only with the affairs of nations, but also the affairs of an ordinary lady like her. And even though her life was filled with bitterness in and of that moment, he was still involved. He wasn't absent. He wasn't absent. Now, friends, I think it would be fair to say that Naomi's view of the world is not the view that many in our day hold. The view that many in our day hold is that our futures are in our hands, that we make our own paths, that we carve our own route out for us. We then look around and we see that there's been 2 world wars, and we see the natural disasters that take place, and we ask the question, is God really in control? Can we truly stand alongside Naomi and look at all of the affairs of the world and say, well, somehow, even though I don't understand it, God is weaving all of these things together into some wonderful redemptive tapestry? Can we say that? Or actually, functionally, are we living as if God is out of control? As if God's been sidelined, pushed to the bench, whilst we human beings are the true players on this pitch? John Piper had this to say about Naomi. He said this: I would take Naomi's theology any day over the sentimental views of God which dominate evangelical magazines and books today. Naomi is unshaken and sure about three things. God exists, God is sovereign, and God has afflicted her. Again, I want to encourage you. Don't be too quick to tidy up the passages. Don't be too quick to reach for the cliches so that we don't have to engage with the difficult questions. Allow the difficult questions to get inside. Allow the difficult questions to disturb you. Allow the difficult questions to get deep down into your heart. Why? Because in that process, maybe you'll see a bigger, more rounded view of who God really is. When we talk about the providence of God, we're not talking about God's miraculous intervention in circumstances, like when he saved the children of Israel. When we talk about the providence of God, we're talking about being able to see God's hand at work, the million activities of God in the everyday, ordinary situations of life. A God who is involved in your Mondays. A God who's actively caring for and relationally engaged in your life. Behind the scenes, many things that you could so easily attribute to coincidence, God is actively involved in your life. David Atkinson, who's wrote a commentary on Ruth, he said this: such belief in God's providence gives a firm standpoint from which to seek and understand the world. We do not see the glories and the tragedies of national and global events and the joys and the pains of day-to-day family life as finding their meaning only within human history or personal biography. Their true meaning lies within the purposes of God, who has made himself known as loving and holy, as personal and infinite, as creator and redeemer, as sustainer and ruler. This is what it means to believe in the providence of God, a God who is relationally, continually involved in the everyday affairs of people. And I've just got 4 very simple things that I think we can learn from Naomi's testimony from chapter 1. The first is this: as I've already said, God reigns in all the affairs of men. In the book of Daniel, Daniel's famous for the story of Daniel and the lion's den, but you should read the book of Daniel. In Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar, who was like the most powerful human being at the time, he had a dream, and eventually that dream became reality at great trauma to himself. And him reflecting upon that circumstance said this, speaking of God: his dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. He does as he pleases with the powers of heavens and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So that's the testimony of one of the most powerful people on planet Earth. He's looking and he's seeing, God, you do what you choose. Psalm 22, verse 28. Dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. Friends, understanding and believing in the providence of God is seeing that the affairs of men are still within the sovereign, providential grasp of our God. But it also means that we believe that the ordinary, everyday affairs of our lives are in His hands as well. Psalm 135:6, whatever the Lord pleases, He does. In heaven and on earth, in the seas and all the deeps. Which is the psalmist's way of saying, wherever the Lord chooses, His will be done. God reigns in all the affairs of men. Secondly, God's providence, His active engagement in the everyday affairs of men and women, is sometimes very hard. Sometimes very hard. You see, this second truth leads us to dive down into the story of Naomi. Naomi is not talking theologically. It's not like she's locked up in some ivory tower. She is living this reality herself as she looks at the world around and she sees that she's lost her husband. She sees that she's lost her 2 sons, and she's looking at all of this, but she's saying this is not chance that has taken place. This is somehow the bitter providence of God that's at work in my life, but I would still prefer to hold on to a sovereign, providential God like that than to believe in a world that is just a global Russian roulette. William Cowper, one of the UK's probably most famous poets, he said this: "Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust Him for His grace. Behind a frowning providence, He hides a smiling face." This is sometimes the seasons that God leads His people into when we're looking at the circumstances around and it feels like a frowning face. It feels like God is frowning upon us. And yet to believe in the providence of God is to understand that even though the circumstances might seem like that, God is still for us. God is still relationally involved in our lives. God still loves us. God is still at work in our lives. Somebody once said, I think it was C.S. Lewis, disappointment and suffering are God's way of dimming the glamour of the world and deepening our ability to enjoy Him. Sometimes the circumstances that we see and think might be out of control, actually, sometimes they're there to bring us to that simple love and enjoyment of our God. God's providence is sometimes very hard. What does that mean? It means that if you're trying to explain God's work with simple cliches, you're going to fall short. Sometimes there's mystery in how God works. Sometimes it's unexplainable how God is at work. But that doesn't mean we can't lean into Him with trust. The third thing we can learn from this story is that sometimes in the midst of the pain and in the midst of the suffering, we can lose sight on reality, even though God is providentially in control. You see, listen to what Naomi says in Ruth 1, verse 11. She says this: "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" In the culture that Naomi and Ruth lived in, there was this whole idea of kinsman redeemers that we're going to get onto in the next few weeks. But the simple idea of a kinsman redeemer is that if a wife is left as a widow, one of the male relations in the household is duty bound to marry her so that she might have kids, that she might have security, that she might have care in her older age. It was a social security mechanism within the people of God. And in her grief, in her pain, she had lost sight of reality because there were actually 2 kinsman redeemers that were available. 2 kinsman redeemers. And this can be so true in our own lives that sometimes we can face circumstances in our lives where we just lose sight of reality. We lose sight because of the pain, because of the problems. We can lose sight of the reality. And the thing that was so dangerous about this was Ruth was, as it were, pushing away God's provision for her by pushing Ruth and Ophrah away from her. We too can do something similar in our own lives. Sometimes we can lose sight of reality because of the pain and the suffering, but it doesn't mean God's providence isn't at work in our lives. And finally, God truly does work for the good and the happiness of His people. Just because God's providence can be hard at times, it doesn't mean that He's no longer working for our good. In fact, this wonderful story of Ruth actually leads to this incredible climax where Ruth gets caught up in the joy of a whole nation as she becomes the grandmother of King David, and she becomes the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of King Jesus. God is working in our lives. God is always working in our lives. God was working in Naomi's life. God was working in Ruth's life. God was working in Boaz's life, who's going to be introduced in the next chapter. And He was working for their joy, but He was also working in and amongst the pain in the moment. And so I want to encourage you, if you're facing a season of pain right now, if you're facing a season of suffering right now, don't be disorientated. Don't reach for simple cliches. Join Naomi in having a solid foundation under your feet where she is able, even in and amongst the pain, to look up to her God and know that He is there, that He is with her, that He is actively involved in her life. Even if you can't understand what God is doing, He still is providentially, actively, relationally involved in your life. And then to do the thing that Naomi didn't do. Lean in and trust. Lean in and trust Him. Lean in that He is a good God and that He is working out His purposes in your life, even when you are completely confused. To lean in. Can I encourage you to do that? I want to encourage us in this season of pandemic to be people that don't offer cheap cliches, but looks to our great God, who is working out His purposes right now in 2021, in and amongst all of the disruption. He is working out His plans. Even in the pain, even in the loss, even in the suffering. I would prefer to believe in that God than a global game of Russian roulette, wouldn't you? And this is what Naomi teaches us. A God who is providentially involved in every millisecond of our lives. Let me pray for you, and then I'm going to hand over to the band. Father God, at the start of this series, on this wonderful, ordinary, yet beautiful story of Ruth and Boaz, as we look at the life of Naomi, who had to navigate a road that not many of us have had to walk down. A road marked and scarred by grief and suffering in huge measure. I pray that we would learn from her testimony, that even in the darkest of valleys, she was still able to look up and see that you were there and that you were in control and that you were actively involved in her life. That her testimony was not, God has abandoned me. She leaned in. And Lord, I pray, would you help us too to lean in and trust you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Outshining all the stars in glory. Your love is like the wildest ocean, and nothing else compares. You are the Lord Almighty, outshining all the stars in glory. Your love is like the wildest ocean, and nothing else compares. A love so great, Jesus, in all things. I've seen a glimpse of your heart, a billion years. Still I'll be singing. How can I praise you enough? How can I praise you enough? You are the Lord Almighty, outshining all the stars in glory. Your love is like the wildest ocean, and nothing else compares. Creation calls to the Savior. You are alive with your praise in earth and sky. No one is higher. Our God of wonders you reign. Our God of wonders you reign. You are the Lord Almighty, outshining all the stars in glory. Your love is like the wildest ocean, and nothing else compares. You are the Lord Almighty, outshining all the stars in glory. Your love is like the wildest ocean, and nothing else compares. Not to us, but to your name, we lift up all praise. Not to us, but to your name, we lift up all praise. Not to us, but to your name, we lift up all praise. Not to us, but to your name, we lift up all praise. You are the Lord Almighty, outshining all the stars in glory. Your love is like the wildest ocean, and nothing else compares.
Before we say goodbye, just a couple of things to mention. There's a Zoom call straight after this meeting, just a chance to chat together. The details are coming up on the screen. We'd love to see you there. Also, if you'd like prayer after this morning, we'd encourage you to connect with your running partners. If you're not yet connected with a running partner group, then please email the care@wearekingsgate.org to ask for prayer. Thank you for being with us and have a great week. We look forward to seeing you next Sunday.